Dr. Montague, Luke, Theodora, and our protagonist Eleanor. All of them are drawn to Hill House. Theo and Nell were not the only people asked to come, but they were the only ones who accepted and didn't back out. Luke was more or less forced to come by the rest of his family. Dr. Montague had his own criteria, but it would seem that it is Hill House's criteria that matters more. So does Hill House attract the people it wants to haunt, or are the people drawn to each other, and Hill House is kind of its magnetic or geographic center? Let's take a look at their characters. Eleanor is a woman who never had a chance to grow up. Instead of leaving home, she was forced to care for her mother until she died, and then she moved into her sister's family home, basically being treated as one of her sister's children, even so far as sleeping on a cot in the baby's room. She's seen as a burden that they have to dutifully bear, but she is definitely alone. She's not really a member of the family. Theo spent vacations growing up at an empty boarding school, which well expresses her relationship with her family. She's also in an ambiguously defined relationship. It's a common critical reading that Theo is in a same-sex relationship. More on this later and how it affects her relationship with Nell, but at the very least, the most basic issue here is that she is at a point of breakdown in her relationship. They're not speaking, and so she is, once again, alone. Luke is a thief and a layabout, a cad. He is ostensibly sent to the house to keep an eye on things, but the barely hidden subtext is that he's sent there to keep him out of trouble, or really, if nothing else, to keep him out of the way. His family is embarrassed by him. He's ostracized from his family. He is motherless, alone. I hope you are seeing a pattern. Dr. Montague is separated from his wife. She disrespects his work. She seems to disrespect him as a person. They practically openly loathe one another. She may be having an affair. He laments that he has no children. He's also disrespected by his colleagues. Once again, he is alone. Remember how I mentioned before that often in literature houses are symbolic for the people who reside in them? One of the primary motifs of the text is the idea of isolation, of aloneness. This isolation works on many levels. The characters are isolated together in Hill House, 6 miles from town, where no one would hear them scream. Miss Dudley tells them this often, that no one would even come close enough to help them, even if they could hear. So they're at the bottom of the cup of the hillsides. And this is all just at the beginning of the story, all of these images of isolation. And as the text progresses, their isolation progresses through deeper levels. Hill House often splits the party apart, both physically and emotionally, into groups, and eventually draws Nell the most as the most vulnerable, because she was the most alone. So if you think about the opening quote of the first chapter, no live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. Whatever walked there, walked alone. We're told from the very beginning what this story is about. Real life is brutal and isolating, and total isolation will drive a person to death. Of course, the question becomes whether the house symbolically attracts the occupants or the occupants symbolically attract the house. Does Hill House attach itself to Eleanor and ultimately cause her death because she was a vulnerable person, or was she always destined for this end? If she had avoided Hill House, not stolen the car, would she have met a different fate? Or would she have met the same fate, just in a different place? Perhaps the answer to that lies in the idea that Hill House itself was not sane. The house was a bad house. Its geometry was off. It was built poorly. The balance of the doors keep them from staying open. The angles meant that expected, vistas out the windows were not seen. And you have to wonder, did something bad about the grounds cause the house to be built that way? Was that an accident? And it's well known that houses that are built this way with bad geometry do cause the people who live in them to go mad over time. There have been many instances of bad houses causing insanity. We also have to take this to mean that Hill House is operating under the conditions of absolute reality. And this is going to be difficult for a woman like Eleanor, who is fundamentally unreliable. She wishes to live in a fantasy story because the story she's actually living in isn't a very pleasant or nice one. So we have a lot of these things being set up at the beginning of the story, questions about really what the story even means, who the story is about, and why. Think about the moment when they're discussing the nature of fear. They understand that fear is generally metaphor, the way we've been discussing all semester. And each one ends up really hitting the nail on the head fairly well. Theo suggested, she's meant to be in the same-sex relationship, but it's not openly talked about. She defines fear as knowing what we really want. And in this time period, that is so astute. Knowing what she really wants and being open about it would have been quite dangerous, quite possibly traumatic consequences could have come from that. Nell tells us she is always afraid of being alone. Now remember, Nell dreams about solitude, so she doesn't mean that she's afraid of solitude. She means she's afraid of being completely alone, of having no one, of not being needed or wanted, of not belonging. Most of the time she finds herself very happy in the house despite everything that's happening because she feels like she belongs there. And that theme of isolation or belonging is really key to understanding everything that this story is really about. So far, we've discussed otherness in general by talking about broad issues of identity, and of course that is at play in this novel, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit later. But there's also the micro sense, that of an individual who doesn't really fit in or belong anywhere. And we see this aloneness in pretty much every character. So you have broken family bonds that echo between the Crane family and the group that's assembled here. You have a broken marriage with the Montagues. You have broken sisterly bonds that seem to be present in the dynamic between Nell and Theo. And you have broken motherly bonds that are discussed both with Nell and with Luke. And this seems to be the idea of broken bonds that is the strongest. But why does that sink its grip into Eleanor so much stronger than with Luke? And I think the idea here is that with Luke, there never really was an actual motherly bond to be broken. He calls Hill House a mother house. He says everything is so soft, everything's so padded, great embracing chairs and sofas, which turn out to be hard and unwelcome when you sit down, and reject you at once. So he has no mother, although it's kind of unclear exactly what he means by that. And the rest of his family makes no secret of their disappointment in him. So when he says he has no mother, it's not so much like Nell, who had a mother and lost her. With Nell, there's a trauma bond. With Luke, there's no bond at all. And a trauma bond is both an extremely strong form of attachment and a much closer analog to what happened with the Crane family. Now, let's look at some of the details of Nell's experience and see how they're specific to this mother-child relationship. So when she first arrives, she mentions, "I am like a small creature swallowed whole by a monster, and the monster feels my tiny little movements inside." Now, this is not a very kind way of describing pregnancy. But that does seem to be what she's describing, where Hill House is her mother and she's the embryo, and the mother is a monster. And think about her relationship to her own mother. She had to be the caretaker for this woman who, by all accounts, was very needy and did not care much for Nell's own needs. And that traditional kind of romanticized notion of the giving, sacrificing mother, that was switched on its head. And later, when she's the only one who can smell that horrible stench in the library, she just kind of murmurs, "My mother, And she knows she wants to tell them something, but she doesn't know what she wants to tell them. But it has this connection between this awful smell and her mother. The knocking noises she hears on her first morning, she mistakes to be her mother knocking at her for help, like calling a servant. And this idea really isn't too far-fetched when you consider the spirit that seems to be communicating with Mrs. Montague through the planchette also seems to be looking for Eleanor's mother, asking for help. It calls itself Eleanor, Nellie, Nell, Nell. It claims to be a child looking for lost home and mother. When they can hear voices, Eleanor and Theo, when they're together, it seems like a child laughing. And when Nell kind of temporarily surrenders to Hill House and her identity becomes subsumed, she becomes the thing that's running through the halls and knocking. She's chasing her mother. Hill House is a very comforting and mothering place in some ways. Luke is right in that way. The beds are very soft. It's got very good cooking, for example. There's all the games to play. And some rooms are completely inside other rooms, like a womb. But they also talk about it being suffocating. The doors are always closed, and they're closing even though you want them open. Like Nell, who had this mother that she cared for and loved, but she had to completely give up her own life. It's very much a mirror of her relationship with her own mother. And it starts to make sense that the house would attach itself to Eleanor, or that Eleanor would attach itself to the house in that symbolic kind of way. Even in the moment when Eleanor is trying to tag along to Theo in the future, she says she's going to come on, and she even suggests that she's going to do it by force if necessary. And Theo's rather cruel in the rejection, and she goes, "Do you always go where you're not wanted?" And Nell just says, "Well, I've never been wanted anywhere. Other people might have done that in a maudlin or whining way, but Nell, it's just direct. It's not self-effacing, it's not self-pitying, it's not whining. She just says it. She's never been wanted anywhere. It's an acknowledgement of the truth." And it's after that complete rejection from Theo that Nell really begins to feel like she belongs at the house. That's when she feels most totally alone. And that's also when she is the most isolated and more alone than anyone else in the house. That's when they tell her she's going to be leaving alone. No one will be contacting her in the future. She will be separated from this group of people she had hoped to be a surrogate family. So she knows she can't really go back. Her mother's dead. Her sister doesn't want her. She can't return because she stole the car. And this group of people that she thought was going to be her surrogate family, they're cutting her off. They don't want her. And the end result is death. She has nothing left. Eleanor's history with Hill House is very close to the story of the Cranes, in more ways than just a broken motherly bond. I mean, there's an absent father, there's a caregiver who is bitter about having the role, feuding sisters, one who inherited a house while driving the other from it. The nursery, the quote heart of the house, is where the party finds a cold spot that they can't actually measure, which suggests some unreality. Remember that the poltergeist activities connected to Eleanor, and Eleanor even calls the cold degrading, which once again suggests it comes from her isolation. A lot of people get a little confused by the ending and Eleanor's actions and what Eleanor thinks. So if you recall, she's leaving in her car, she's being forced to leave, and she comes around the bend, drives her car directly into the same tree. If you recall that the initial death that the Crane family had, that wasn't, of course, a car, it was a horse, and she has a moment when she thinks, I am really doing it. I'm doing this all by myself. Now at last, this is me. I'm really, really doing it by myself. And she seems quite proud. And of course, that makes a lot of sense, because this is really the first time in her entire life she's behaved with any agency, except for the moment she, came to Hill House. Although we have to question if that was agency or that was Hill House driving her. But we know that that has to do with her isolation. She knows she's unwanted anywhere. And the only place that seems to want her is Hill House. And we know that the only thing that she fears is being alone. She doesn't think she'll be alone in Hill House. She seems to think that there's like a spirit of her mother, or a mothering spirit at Hill House that will want her. She also seems to think it is a choice she is making, as opposed to a choice she is being led into by duty or society or the direct orders of other people. But then she has this swift, well, wait a minute, why aren't they stopping me? Because, of course, ultimately, she doesn't want to leave them. She wants a family. She doesn't want that to be what the ultimate choice is, because she wants them to step up and say, no, Nell, we want you. But we all know that's not what's going to happen. So that's what the ending is about. The true horror of Hill House is that it's just an illusion of agency. It was always just a cry for them to change her mind and want her to come back. We know that the psychological ghost story is a story about identity. If we break down the secrets of the haunting, we understand the person being haunted. So is Eleanor a victim, or is Eleanor doing the haunting? Well, a major question of this story is how much of it we can trust. So from the outset, we see Nell daydreaming, so we can never be sure how much of the story that we are getting is absolute truth, which of course is an irony, considering the story's opening lines about conditions of absolute reality. And this is also a foreshadowing. If Nell has been using daydreams to escape the conditions of her day-to-day life, being forced to come to terms with these conditions is bound to create some cognitive dissonance. And remember, too, that Eleanor has been suspected of creating poltergeist activity in the past. So the text suggests that having to deal with all of this trauma is causing Eleanor to create these happenings through telekinesis, without being consciously aware that she is doing it. Remember the timing of the poltergeist activity in her childhood. Eleanor has had to give up her youth and chance at a family to take care of her mother, who all indications suggest she was abusive to her, while her family, her sister, was able to grow up and move on without her. And think about the conditions of her mother's death. She admits that she thinks she heard her mother crying out for her medicine, and she ignored it and went back to sleep. And after that, she was forced to move back into her sister's house and sleep on a cot in the nursery, like a child, dependent on her sister for everything. She had to steal the car she'd helped buy just to leave for any length of time, and her medical problems were burdensome because it was interrupting her sister's vacation plans. It was no wonder she wanted to escape. So the kind of person she became was just an escapist person. She imagined a fantasy where she could immediately walk into a surrogate family. She imagined an apartment that she lived in. And upon discovering that none of these things would happen, she had to face the reality that she would one day have to return to her sister. And again, recall what happens upon the conditions of absolute reality. And she couldn't face that. There's a lot of academic discussion about how to read the relationships between Eleanor and Theo and Eleanor and Luke. Theo is generally regarded as at least bisexual, although she is not generally regarded as having romantic or sexual feelings toward Nell. Eleanor's feelings toward Theo are less clear. So she's clearly very attached, but is this a result of a sexual or romantic attachment? Is this a result of a platonic friendship? Or just like a sisterly kind of affection trying to replace the poor relationship with her own sister? The idea of a sexual affection is reinforced by Eleanor's kind of constant refrain of that journey's end and lovers meeting, But does that relate to Theo? Does that relate to Luke? Or is this just kind of a childlike fantasy that she doesn't seem to grasp the meaning of? She does seem to attempt to force relationships rather than build them. It is worth noting that this is from a speech from The Clown in Twelfth Night, which is a play about mistaken identities and people trying to force relationships. She's gone directly from childhood to playing nurse for her mother. She was never able to develop a sense of adulthood or healthy sexuality or even her own desires or relationships that aren't dependent or codependent. Her crush on Luke seems performative. Some critics have read this as her own queerness, but others read it as proof that she never really developed enough as an adult to have the emotions required to feel that kind of romantic attachment. And when she's alone with Luke, she decides he's selfish and boring. She believes she's holding Theo's hand during a haunting, and it is Theo's clothes that are doused in phantom blood. And it's worth noting also that there's only one major ghostly manifestation at Hill House that Eleanor doesn't see. And that's whatever Theo sees when she looks back at the ghost picnic, which is an idyllic moment for Eleanor, representing a beautiful family outing that they were driven to by a vicious argument, the spirit of which argument is presumably too unspeakable for Theo to mention. And it was an argument kind of over how Eleanor was behaving toward Luke. So the whole idea about Eleanor's ability to form relationships with other people seems to form the crux of her isolation and othering. Whatever the basis of that is seems to be up for debate. But it's almost like the text is telling us that Eleanor is responsible for her own isolation because the trauma she has suffered has made her unable to form relationships. There are even critics who will call it, and they'll do an autistic reading. I don't think there's enough in the text to support that, but that does exist.